By contrast, East Asia, which had a precipitous decline in fertility, had the most rapid demographic transition in history, far faster than what occurred earlier in Western Europe and North America. And today, East Asia has more than 2.3 workers for every non-worker, which is much more than Sub-Saharan Africa's 1.2 workers per non-worker. That's a really big difference. It's akin to a household having a whole extra worker for every non-worker. Now, for a household, that kind of differential, an extra worker for every non-worker, would tend to translate into a commensurately large increase in income per household member. And this intuition about individual households essentially aggregates up to the level of countries and regions. So the essential insight here is that fertility decline lowers youth dependency immediately, but doesn't affect the working age population appreciably for 20 to 25 years. And that interval of time is a time period in which the economy has a golden opportunity to grow. These ideas, added up, suggest that the superior economic performance of East Asia and its tiger economies since the mid-1970s is not coincidentally related to East Asia's demographics. What I'm arguing is that it is causally related to the demographic transition which led East Asia's age structure to evolve in a way that's been highly favorable for economic growth and for the enjoyment of a demographic dividend. Demonstrating this point, using rigorous theoretical and statistical tools and appropriate data is an activity that has occupied many economists around the world during the past 10 years. And that body of work has shown, quite decisively, I would say, that roughly 2 percentage points of the growth rate of income per capita in East Asia, representing about a third of the so-called miracle, can be accounted for by demographic change. In other words, economic growth in East Asia was not a miracle at all. Thinking that it was a miracle was simply a reflection of our ignorance because we neglected to take proper account of demographics. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that demography is destiny or that growth of the working age share of the population automatically leads to economic growth. I'm simply saying that demographic change can lead the development process by enhancing the potential for economic growth. The failure to capture this potential will mean that large numbers of prime-age individuals are unemployed, underemployed, or otherwise not constructively engaged. And that could trigger a demographic disaster, promoting the fragility and failure of states, and possibly with adverse political, social, economic, and also environmental spillovers to other countries. To generate and capture a demographic dividend, some countries need to think about catalyzing the demographic transition, which traditionally happens via public health investments in primary health care, safe water and sanitation, vaccines and drugs, all of which tend to reduce infant and child mortality rates. The second of the recent breakthrough ideas is often summarized by the phrase, healthier means wealthier. In other words, that health and longevity are very consequential for economic performance. Although macroeconomists and economic policymakers have traditionally viewed population health as a social indicator that improves after countries get rich, the latest thinking views health itself as an instrument of economic growth. In other words, health is not simply a consequence of economic growth, it's also a cause of economic growth, with the possibility of virtuous spirals in which health improvements lead to income growth, which leads to further health improvements, and so on. Health is believed to be a driver of economic growth for 4 main reasons, all of which I think you'll find quite intuitive. First, because a healthier workforce is a more productive workforce. Second, because healthier children do better while they're in school, and they also tend to have better records of school attendance and to stay in school for more years. Third, because healthy populations have higher savings rates as people save more in anticipation of longer periods of retirement. And finally, because healthy populations are like a magnet when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment. In recent years, analyses of the proposition that healthier means wealthier have abounded, and nearly all of them highlight the influence of health as a driver of economic growth. So to appreciate this point, let's conduct a little thought experiment in which we imagine 2 countries that are identical in all key dimensions pertinent to economic growth, except that the people in one country are healthier than the people in the other. This new finding suggests that the healthier country will grow its average income faster than the less healthy country. It also tells us that a 10-year gain in life expectancy translates into as much as 1 additional percentage point of annual growth of income per capita. Now, a 1 percentage point advantage may not sound like much, but in a world economy in which per capita income typically grows at 2, 3, maybe 4% per year, it's actually a big deal. And part of the reason it's a big deal is because of compound interest, which serves to magnify the effect of that 1% boost when it's maintained over time. A 1 percentage point gain is also meaningful because a 10-year gain in life expectancy is well within the grasp of a large number of countries. It corresponds roughly to the life expectancy improvement that India, where life expectancy is currently about 65, it's the life expectancy improvement that India would enjoy if it achieved the same life expectancy as today's developed countries, which is currently about 78 years. It also corresponds to the life expectancy improvement that even the most pessimistic demographers in the world project for the wealthy industrial countries during this century. I'd also like to note here in passing the central importance of health, not just to the growth of income, but also to the alleviation of poverty. If you think about it for a moment, you'll quickly realize that the main asset that poor people possess is their labor. And the value of that asset is crucially determined by their health. And that explains why health figures so prominently in plans to halve the global poverty rate, which has emerged as the central imperative of the entire global development community. So as I noted earlier, cross-country analyses suggest that a third, about 2 percentage points, of the growth of income per capita in East Asia during the miracle years may be attributed to the independent influence of changes in age structure that followed on from the demographic transition that started in the 1960s. And that's in addition to this health effect that I just discussed. So if you combine the effects of age structure and health improvements, what that tells us is that demographic change can lead to a huge and sustainable boost in income. So now that we're up to date on the latest thinking about the nature and magnitude of the contributions that demographics can make to economic growth, I'd like to turn our attention to the implications of these new ideas for economic prospects here in India. I'll start with some rapid-fire facts about Indian demographics in the past, present, and future. First of all, since 1950, India has experienced a 70% decline in the infant mortality rate. Second, India has enjoyed an extraordinary improvement in overall population health since 1950, with life expectancy increasing at an average pace of 4.5 years per decade. And that is really quite extraordinary. For most of human history, people lived to about 30 years. And now India's added essentially 25 years to life expectancy in the last several decades, in the last 5 decades alone. Third, fertility rates in India have declined sharply from about 6 children per woman in the 1950s to 2.7 children per woman today. And finally, the decline of birth and death rates show that India is well along in its demographic transition. Now, the interplay of these mortality and fertility changes implies sizable changes in the age structure of India's population. And to demonstrate for you the impact of these changes on the age structure of the population, what I'd like to do is take you through a succession of population pyramids for India. So I'm going to start with the 1950 pyramid, which is going to show you the percentage of population in each age group. Men are going to be on the left side in blue, and women are going to be on the right side in red. And what you see here is that in 1950, India had a very young population, with children dominating adults and adults dominating the elderly. And that pattern is what gave rise to India's pyramidal shape. Sorry, we seem to have... Started again. Okay, and what I hope you saw, I'm sorry, little malfunction here, is that as you move forward in time, the base of that pyramid is basically getting relatively smaller, and the pyramid is changing shape, and it's coming actually to look like some of us, a little thick around the waist. Okay. Now, there's another way to look at these changes in the age structure of the population, and that is, in other words, looking at the phenomenon of the pig moving through the python. And we can do that by examining, as you see here, the ratio of working-age Indians to non-working-age Indians. So what I plotted here are historical figures from 1950 through 2010, and as you see, they show, and that would be the green line there, it shows a steady improvement in that ratio of working age to non-working age population. I've also plotted the UN projections out to 2050. And here I'd just like to point out to you, the UN makes 3 different projections for the future, corresponding to low, medium, and high fertility scenarios. These scenarios have very different implications for the future age structure of India's population, but as you can see, they all suggest further growth in the working age share, and that's good news for India. As a point of reference to demonstrate that, I think it's useful to compare India with East Asia. And let me make a few comments about this comparison. First, the ratio of working age to non-working age people in India has been lower than that of East Asia since 1950. In other words, the green line is lower than that red line in the past. Okay, and that corresponds to the high burden of youth dependency here in India. Second comment, India's demographic cycle has been about 25 years out of phase with that of East Asia. So a pure demographic perspective here suggests that the next 3 decades, in other words, going forward into the future, will be a period of catch-up for India, and catch-up with respect to per capita income. Third, in all 3 fertility scenarios going forward, the low, medium, and high, the working age ratio is slated to increase. But under the low fertility scenario, India will reach a higher working age ratio than East Asia ever did. The medium scenario shows India reaching nearly as high as East Asia's high point, and the high scenario shows a rather modest increase over today's ratio. The point here is that the medium and low fertility scenarios bode quite well with respect to India's potential for reaping a sizable demographic dividend, representing what could amount to an additional percentage point of income growth. Now, that's 1 additional percentage point of income growth compounded year after year. And that's not a trivial sum, given that the annual rate of growth of India's income per capita averaged just a little over 4% during the past 3 decades. And to dig just a little bit deeper here, we can look at this from a slightly different angle by comparing the economic performance of India and China. So this chart that you see shows that India had 66% higher income than did China in 1980. Okay, but by the early 1990s, China had overtaken India with respect to per capita income, and now the income situation is completely reversed, with income per capita in China now double that of India. Part of the reason for the income crossover, I believe, can be traced to the very different demographic trajectories of China and India. So these 2 population superpowers, somewhat ironically, can lay claim to establishing the world's earliest national family planning programs. India launched the first program in 1952, and China followed suit in 1956. In strictly demographic terms, China's campaign of later, longer, and fewer, and its one-child policy led to a precipitous decline in fertility and a sharp rise in the working age share of the population. Like China's, India's family planning program led to abuse, but it also led to a political backlash that ultimately set back its family planning efforts and left India's demographic trajectory very much out of phase with China's. And because demographics are such a powerful driver of economic performance, India and China's economic trajectories also began to diverge. But the situation is, as I've noted, about to change as India's working age share continues to rise, in contrast to China's, which is projected to fall. And that indicates that India is poised to gain back some of the economic ground that it's lost to China in the last 2 decades.